A woman already suing former SNL star Horatio Sanz for sexual assault has filed an amended complaint asking to add Jimmy Fallon, Lorne Michaels, and Tracy Morgan as defendants. So, what does this mean for the show and all four of these men? I'm Angenette Levy, and welcome to this latest edition of Law&Crime's Sidebar podcast. Well, Horatio Sanz is being sued by a woman who was a teenager back in 2001, 2002, and she had accused him of doing some things at after parties for Saturday Night Live that were of a sexual nature. She was younger than 17. During one of these incidents, and it's really a disturbing allegation. So joining us to talk about this is entertainment attorney Mitra Ahouraian. Mitra, welcome back to Sidebar. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Angenette. Good to be here as always.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. Your thoughts on this woman, the Jane Doe, we don't know her name, but she's named Jane Doe or goes by Jane Doe in the complaint, seeking to add Lorne Michaels, who created Saturday Night Live back in the mid 70s. And then, of course, Jimmy Fallon, who started his career there, and Tracy Morgan, who was on SNL for years and also is now an actor and comedian taking part in other projects.
Yeah, it's really interesting because this case sort of opens the conversation about whether other people can be held accountable for witnessing sexual abuse and sort of inappropriate sexual behavior by virtue of the fact that they enabled it and didn't say anything about it. Her amended complaint sets out in very um, uh, you know detail about everything that happened, all the times that everyone knew she was underage. There's sort of no question about that because she had many conversations about her age. She had this fan page that everyone knew about, all sort of the big players at NBC, because she had developed quite a reputation. And so the discussion now is, can these other people be held accountable, and can people in general be held accountable for other people's sexual behavior?
And I want to talk about the fact that she said that this was going on not only when she was 17, but as early as 15. I mean, it was the year 2000 is when she says that this started. And it's there's some disturbing allegations. I mean, there's talk of digital penetration by Horatio Sanz. This is the allegation. Also, the fact that the others witnessed this, they saw it going on. And I have no doubt in my mind that SNL has probably had some wild after parties. I mean, we know that there are people who've been on SNL who've had issues with substances and things like that. So, but just because there were parties where substances were being abused or used doesn't mean automatically that they're guilty of some type of sex assault.
Right. So, this raises the question of whether an employer has a duty of care to attendees at their parties or at their events. And the first question is, how much of was this were these parties actually thrown by NBC? Certainly, they were endorsed to some degree, but Horatio talks about the fact that finding the venue was sort of part of his job. Now, I don't know if that's his interpretation, or if NBC actually, if this was an official SNL event, which I think will play some role in whether they have some accountability. Because certainly, if this happened at work, then that's something that they do have a duty to protect against people, particularly children, something like this happening.
And this woman at one point was obviously a 15-year-old girl. She said she was a fan of the show, it sounds like, when she was at one of these parties. And then things evolved from there. NBC has already tried to have this suit dismissed before. And they're going to try again to have the suit dismissed. A spokesperson has told Variety. So I don't know. It's an interesting question because these people are a network like NBC obviously has insurance. So if it was an NBC sanctioned party or an SNL party that's under the umbrella of NBC, I guess it is possible they could bear some responsibility, or, their insurance company or something like that at the time.
Yeah, one of the things that the complaint does raise is that NBC sort of fostered this culture of not treating women well, treating women as sort of sexual objects, and that being okay. I think in the comedy space, we've also seen a lot of pressure on female comedians to sort of be a bit vulgar as part of their comedy. Not, obviously not all women, but there are women who kind of feel that. Um, that's the way to get a laugh. The SNL environment was known for being wild. There are statements made by multiple people who are, on in the cast, who were interns, other employees. It was, these were wild parties known in New York, and celebrities were there, and underage drinking took place, which is not unusual. Anyone who's lived in a big city knows this. It's not unusual to have underage girls, but I think that where that line is drawn is really the safety of the children that are there. I mean, it's kind of hard to think of, the fact that a 15-year-old is a child.
Hmm. And a 15-year-old is, I was just thinking about that, is a child. I'm thinking about the neighbors down the street. One's 13, another is 12. 15's not that far away from that. So I'm thinking, you're a kid. And even though you turn 18 and you're technically an adult, in a lot of ways, you're still immature and you're not really an adult, even though you're legally an adult. One of the quotes that's kind of kicks off this amended complaint, Mitra, is kind of shocking. It's quotes Tracy Morgan, who was at apparently this party where this woman, who's now much older, obviously, but at the time was 17. Tracy Morgan is quoted as saying about this party, they put a stage in it, they put a few futons all around, and they get strippers and girls to come and do shows. You'd walk in there, and he describes oral sex taking place. There was usually some other sex going on, and there was liquor and couches everywhere. I'm cleaning that up. I'm not using the actual verbiage that's in the quote, but that really does paint a picture. If Tracy Morgan said that, and that's what was actually going on, and he wasn't just being sarcastic or what have you, that really does paint a kind of a disturbing picture, especially if there were teenage underage girls there.
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 things really make this, cross the line. There are certainly parties like that happen among consensual adults. There are certainly, in people's homes, other venues, but the 2 things that really make everyone wonder whether this is okay is the fact that there were underage girls there, that was encouraged and ignored, that alcohol was served to them, and also that this was potentially endorsed by the employers. So I think those 2 things really distinguish this from parties like that perhaps happen all the time.
And what I find interesting as well is that Jane Doe, apparently, according to this complaint, kept a log of who was at the shows that she attended, who hosted, who the guest was. It's in the complaint, and it's written in there from October 7th and 8th, 2000 through May of 2002. I mean, she's got everything documented. I don't know. Obviously, she's got a lot of details about the allegations she's making as well. What does this mean for their careers? I mean, we're talking about it here on Sidebar. Jimmy Fallon hosts the Tonight Show. The obvious heir apparent to Johnny Carson, or Jay Leno, I should say, not Johnny Carson, but Jay Leno. So Jimmy Fallon's a big name. He's on TV every night. He's in people's homes. Lorne Michaels still runs the show at SNL. So what does this mean for them?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if they are found accountable, then that would have a huge impact on their case. And, we have seen time and again sort of this cancel culture of our celebrities who are involved in these sorts of scandals. And I don't know that that's going to be the ruling in this case. I think that there will certainly be a taint, even if they are found not to be responsible. But and if they are found not to be responsible, they'll probably continue going on about their business. But if there is some responsibility here, I think that that would change everything.
What I think is interesting too, you bring up the cancel culture, but obviously, an allegation can lead to somebody being canceled. Just simply the allegation. We've seen it happen many times, and so there's no due process anymore in some respects in Hollywood. I mean, this just destroys you. And obviously, New York's not in Hollywood, but it's all show business. So, I mean, does anything come of it before the suit proceeds? Because Lorne Michaels is a huge name. He's a famous guy. I mean, everybody knows who he is, especially if you watch SNL. And Jimmy Fallon, as I mentioned, he's in your home every night. So, do you see repercussions coming from this, um, just because of the allegation itself?
I mean, certainly there's a taint people will be questioning, but I do think that there is a distinction between having been there and perhaps known, versus being active in the sexual abuse and, sort of maybe covering it up. I think there's a distinction there. And I think that the public is probably a lot more willing to allow for due process when we're looking at sort of these ancillary characters in the process. I think a lot less for the person that is grooming a child that has this inappropriate relationship that goes on for years. He said that in the early days when he was, just messaging her on, I think it was AOL at the time, but when he was messaging her inappropriately when she was like 15, he admitted later, many years later, when she no longer had a relationship, that he was masturbating during those calls. Or during those texts and stuff, which is really awful. And she said, "Wow, I had no idea." She was so young and innocent that she had no idea that that was happening. She was just excited to be getting attention from a celebrity and some of her idols on a show that she aspired to be a part of at some point.
This is a really detailed amended complaint that we've been reading through. And one of the things that I find is interesting in it is that it recalls or recounts other like female cast members of SNL. Jane Curtin, Julia Louise Dreyfus, Julia Louise Dreyfus, a bunch of female former cast members who described a sexist culture at SNL, that this was really more of a boys' club. And we have Lorne Michaels quoted in bullet point number 33 saying that the SNL after parties quickly became the coolest, wildest, most important show business parties in the city. That would be in New York City. So there's a lot in here. We could go through it probably for hours if we wanted to. But it doesn't sound very good. So what do you see happening with this? I mean, if the suit is not dismissed as NBC wants it to be, uh, do they go through depositions and the whole nine yards? I mean, does this actually go to trial? I can't imagine that NBC or Lorne Michaels or Jimmy Fallon would want this to go to trial. And I do want to say Horatio Sanz's lawyer, Andrew Brettler, who's a famous lawyer in Hollywood, denies that this happened.
I think that there is quite a bit of evidence. I think there are certainly witnesses. The tricky thing is that, this is in the early 2000s, right? So it's now been over a decade. As we've talked about before, and as the New York sort of has these look back window over the past 2 years, have allowed victims of child sex abuse to bring lawsuits within this 2 year period, even if the statute has passed. So she was able to file this lawsuit much years later. But the challenge, of course, with crimes that happen years later is really finding those witnesses. Luckily, she did a great job of having. She's somebody who journals, so she's got her journals. She's got, there are other witnesses that she is still able to talk to, some of her former friends. But if this, if NBC is found to be responsible, and certainly some of the quotes you said, it really sounds like the parties were at the very least endorsed, even if they weren't thrown officially by NBC and were officially a work party, so to speak. I think certainly the argument that there was an endorsement can be made, and that gets tricky. If you can now, as an employer, be responsible for the crimes of people or your employees or others at parties that you endorse, does that create a liability? I think that creates a really interesting conversation and can open the door to a lot of lawsuits.
That makes me think about, and I've discussed this with people before. I remember years ago, a lot of companies stopped having holiday parties because there was liability, possible liability if people were driving home drunk from these parties and things of that nature. So it seems to me that possibly a company could be held liable.
Yeah, it's certainly in line with that. And drunk driving is certainly a crime, but this seems to really cross many, many, many lines. And we take sexual assault of children, very seriously. And this is something that impacted her life for years, even today. If you see, sort of like the decline of her mental and emotional state and the shame she experienced after this, thinking that, this was all of this that happened was her fault. At that age, you think you know everything, but really you don't, and you don't have enough life experience to know that people have bad intentions sometimes. And, for all intents and purposes, people thought that they were a couple. The way that people described their relationship was sort of sounded like they were a couple. So, certainly people witnessed that.
The detail in this complaint is really it's something, and what she describes does sound like grooming. Again, Horatio Sanz denies this through his attorney Andrew Bretler, but there is a lot of detail in this. And this girl started going to the show in the standby line. She was a fan. She obviously was enamored with these people, the actors acknowledging her. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of this, and we'll keep an eye on it for sure. Mitra Ahouraian, as always, thank you so much for coming on Sidebar. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Angenette.
And that's it for this edition of Law and Crime Sidebar podcast. It is produced by Sam Goldberg and Michael Deininger. Bobby Szoke is our YouTube manager. Alyssa Fisher is our booking producer, and Kiera Bronson handles our social media. You can listen to Sidebar on Apple, Spotify, Google, and wherever else you get your podcasts. And of course, you can watch it on Law and Crime's YouTube channel. I'm Angenette Levy, and we'll see you next time.